Hey, everybody. Welcome back. This is our final and last workshop for the semester. And today we're going to be talking to you about graduate school funding, what exactly that means, how to get your money. So again, this is our disclosure statement. We won't read it in full, but just so you know, it's here. So to go into what does a fully funded PhD program really mean?
Did you even think about funding before you applied to graduate school?
I just applied. So when I first heard about grad school, I was actually going to pharmacy school, which we've talked about this.
Yeah.
But we were just like, oh, you should go to get a PhD. It's free. So all I knew that a PhD was free. I didn't think about the logistics.
Yeah.
Didn't know the logistics till I got here.
Right. I think I just assumed that most biomedical sciences, which is what I was going to do, was paid for. So I didn't have to even think about it.
I actually thought all PhDs are free until I got to graduate school.
Ooh.
So, yeah, it's a lot of research I didn't do, but I guess today will actually help you understand what fully funded actually means. It can mean different things depending on where you are.
That's the main thing. Yep. So what's really interesting is the real cost of graduate school. So as many of you know, graduate education is not free. Someone has to pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this figure here, done by a group of researchers through the American Psychological Association, basically pointed out that doctoral education, the tuition for both in-state and out-of-state students is, one, extremely high, but it ranges from about $20,000 to upwards of like $40,000 to $42,000. And that's just tuition alone. Like, not including any of the other expenses that you may think about. So when I saw this, I was like, whoa, wasn't even thinking about my graduate education, but to think mine falls somewhere in that and I don't have to pay that, but I could, was a huge eye opener to me. So the point is, hey, there's a cost to graduate education. And what does that mean? Is that something that you should consider in applying to graduate school? I think so.
I don't think so, but
really,
I don't. But it's good information to have. You see, it also follows the trend for undergrad. So usually private schools are more expensive than public school, than in-state and out-of-state. But I think it doesn't matter depending on where you are. I will say that. I don't think you shouldn't consider it.
Right.
I just think that.
Would you say that you should consider if you have to pay for it?
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. If you don't have to pay for it, I wouldn't consider tuition because you're not paying it. So that's what I mean. Like, not that you shouldn't consider, but if you're going to a program where you have to pay, of course you could consider. I've considered it in undergrad.
Right. So this is still a concern, I guess, that other people should have, or at least maybe think about as you're applying to different programs.
And we'll talk about why a little bit later.
Yeah. However, as we mentioned tuition, there are a lot of other things that actually contribute to the cost of graduate education.
Yes, such as, so in addition to tuition, you have registration fees that somebody's paying for. There's usually a student government fee, student legal services, university unions and recreational sports.
That's the gym, literally.
Yeah, and to use the space, and then insurance. So all of these are things that you should consider. So I said how I felt about tuition, because I feel like if you go into a PC program, at the minimum, you shouldn't be paying tuition.
Right.
But these are also other things that come into the cost that you may or may not have to pay for depending on your institution. So you should definitely consider that.
Mm-hmm.
So benefits. So some programs, institutions will offer you benefits like insurance and travel support for conferences and meetings and daycare. So I will say that we are a bit privileged here because we get health insurance, we get dental insurance for ourselves and our dependents at no cost. And we also, I get travel support, but this is through my grant, but there's travel support at the institution. And then there's also child and family support that's offered to graduate students.
That's really new as far as when you travel, like grants or institutions will help pay for supplementing daycare.
Right.
For traveling students that travel. So,
but even here, so there's like a child care stipend that you can get as a graduate student.
Oh.
If you had, and a lot of people don't know because a lot of people don't go to the places that has the resources, but they can help subsidize daycare if you meet certain requirements. There's also an extra grant, I think, for people that come from out of state, but their children are out of state and they have to travel back home to see their children.
Whoa.
So just think about these things. There's a lot of different benefits. If there's something particular to your situation that you have questions about, I would definitely ask the program if these are things that are available to you as a graduate student. So student fees. And this is kind of a gray area because sometimes you don't really know what the student fees go to. It might just say student fees. But there's usually always a fee. Yep. But you definitely want to see if you have to pay for it or if it's covered in your fully funded package.
Right.
So sometimes international students have to pay a student fee that we don't have to pay. But there are institutions or even domestic students have to pay a student fee.
And then knowing whether or not that fee is per semester or for the entire year.
Yes.
Different amounts of money for different kind of lengths of resources.
That's a valid point because sometimes you'll hear a small number like, oh, that's per year, and it's really a semester. So if you want to actually see if you have to pay for those student fees. So you can be thinking about that now while you're applying. And you can also think about that later when you get accepted into your institution. Yep. Stipends. So I won't say most because that is not a lot of biomedical science PhD programs usually provide you a stipend, but it's not guaranteed at every institution. I do know students that are in biomedical science programs that their funding is not guaranteed every year, meaning their stipend is not set for like the 5-year period that you're supposed to be here, meaning that we have to figure out how we're going to pay this student stipend next year, like on a year-by-year basis. Also, taxable income. You want to talk a little bit about taxable income?
Sure. So basically, as most graduate students are typically probably not working, although we'll talk about that later as well. Yeah. Usually your stipend, the amount of money that you get is to subsidize that. So you have to actually report in some cases how much money you make from your stipend, how much money you get from the institution. And this also varies based on case by case, institution and state that you're in, because you have to pay federal and state taxes. So these are all things that you still have to consider. Not even like I wasn't even thinking about this before I graduated before I started graduate school. But it's definitely something that you have to think about. Filing taxes.
I would definitely say, consider the taxable income part, especially if you've never paid taxes because you've never worked a job where you had to. So I know I did a post-bac program before I came here, but their graduate students did not have to pay their own taxes. It was taken out for them.
Oh, nice.
And that is actually, it just depends. But like having to pay if it's not taxed, the burden usually falls on you to either pay quarterly,
right,
or you can pay at the end of the year, but I think you might have to pay an extra fee or something. I think that's a small window where you don't have to, but consider whether or not you have to do your own taxes. That might be important to you. You might not want to go anywhere if they don't tax it for you because it's an extra mental responsibility that you have to do. So,
and usually your programs will tell you kind of how students typically deal with taxes, or you can ask students when you interview how they deal with taxes.
I've actually never known a place that did not take taxes out until I started grad school.
Yeah, same.
So it really varies. Emergency funds. So some institutions will have these things available to you. I know we have them, but you definitely want to see if there are any funds. Say if you have to have a medical procedure or you have to go home for an emergency, you live out of state. If those things are important to you, you can definitely inquire about whether or not there's extra money for things that come up. Because let's be honest, stipends are great. You don't have to work like punch a clock, but they're not a lot of money. They're you're going to be living paycheck to paycheck in most instances. And I'm just being honest with you. Like, so when you look at a number for a stipend, like somebody might be getting $24,000 in Atlanta and getting $34,000 a year in New York. But the cost of living is different. So you definitely have to consider, okay, this is the stipend, but what's the cost of living? How can I actually live on this stipend when I get there?
Right. And that will kind of determine when you get to that point of trying to make decisions, how am I going to be able to manage my stipend with the living expenses that I'm going to have or incur? And what's really interesting is that as you're in graduate school, you're basically still living life. and things happen.
Yeah.
Your car breaks down. Like you said, something happens tragic with your family. You have to go somewhere. If there are emergency funds available for students in that kind of situation, then you want to know that what are those resources and are those resources available? Because you are taking, in some cases, not that big a pay cut from what you could be doing.
I took a significant pay cut.
Yeah.
I did my post-bac and I also had a job. So I had 2 incomes. And I also was in the South where cost of living was cheaper. So I did take a significant pay cut. So you also have to consider, okay, what am I making now? Because some of you might be working in school or already working and not in school. And how is your lifestyle going to have to change if you have to take this pay cut?
Yeah. It's the one thing that's kind of almost stopping one of my close friends' cousin from going into graduate school is the fact that she has bills. So that's something that we could talk about at a later date.
Yeah.
But and then lastly, I think dissertation support. So as you're finishing up your PhD, is there money and resources available to help you kind of just finish whatever it is, whether it's another semester that you need just to write? Mm-hmm. Is there kind of funds that you can kind of take a hold of in order to kind of work on that? So from this, there are a lot of different ways that you can actually get funding as graduate students. And these are prominent for, I think, prominently found through grants, but also fellowships and other funding resources as well. So based on this, we basically created this continuum that basically says money that funds you as a student or the research that you're going to be doing as a graduate student. And so the first thing are kind of what I think is the big 3. So the NSF, National Science Foundation, has a graduate research fellowship program. There's the Ford Fellowship, which is through the National Academy of Medicine, and then the Department of Defense, which is another pre-doctoral fellowship that's for students that can apply all the way out from a year before you even apply to graduate school. And most of those are geared towards funding you.
So another thing that a lot of students have to fund them is institutional merit fellowships. So we're going to put up a lot of different funding sources. So we're putting them in the order of relevance and work. So the first 3 we talked about, those are things that you can actually apply for now before you get into your PhD program. And we'll talk about them in detail later. But once you actually get into the school, they have additional fellowships usually. So I came in on an institutional merit fellowship from my institution, and it funded my stipend for 10 months, and then my program took over. So it provided some support for me. There's also R01 supplement grants. So R01s are for the PI or the boss in the lab, but there's R01 supplements that are exclusively or typically for underrepresented students. So if you're an underrepresented student, your PI can apply for additional funds to support you on their grant.
Right. So also most institutions that have graduate programs may also have what we call training grants, which basically come from the National Institutes of Health. And these are designated as T32. We'll talk about those more later, but essentially it's a training grant that funds a few students within a program kind of towards a specific field or track. Mm-hmm. And then you have the NRSA, which is more of a individual base. So each graduate student has to apply for their own NRSA or F31, and that stands for fellowship. F stands for fellowship.
And the NRSA is an award that's also granted through the NIH, which is the National Institutes of Health. Also, so this box is in red because it's not as typical, I don't think. But there are some programs where you might have to teach, and that funds you on your salary. So some programs will have teaching fellowship programs where you are required to teach. I know a lot of my friends that are not in the biomedical sciences do have to teach to pay their salary. We have to teach in my program, but it did not provide salary support. It was more for teaching experience.
Oh, wow.
So it wasn't a teaching fellowship program, but in order to graduate, I had to do a semester of teaching as my graduation requirement. But if teaching is something that you want to do, whether it's through a fellowship program or not, again, those are things that you can ask. If you don't want to teach to fund your program, then maybe you don't want to look at institutions that require you to teach, if that's something that you are like anti doing, you might consider maybe replacing that institution with another program.
And then I think what maybe last is the DSPAN. So DSPAN is one of the new funding mechanisms for graduate students, and specifically in neuroscience, I believe cancer biology. And so what this is for is basically to fund you towards the end of your PhD career and then the first portion of your postdoc.
And then also there are external foundations and institutional grants that you may be able to apply for to actually fund your research. Even if it's just like equipment or supplies for your research. And then, so you can look up different external foundations to look for funding, but your institution may or may not have grants that you can apply for. So we have the option to apply for a pre-doctoral grant or a pre-candidate grant to fund your research. And then after that, there's like a post-candidate grant. They're smaller awards, but they are for funding your research and not funding your salary.
Right. So we talked a lot about kind of what in different sources of money, but why are fellowships and grants really important? So one is basically financial support. So you need money to essentially fund the research that you do, to pay you your stipend, to go to conferences and travel, as well as the everyday lab expenses that you may occur to actually run your experiments. Fellowships typically look great on your CV, especially if you're interested in going to academia. You want to show that you're able to actually apply and successfully get grants, because that's kind of one of the major components of actually running a lab, a successful lab. The other really nice thing that I think I definitely don't necessarily take advantage of is the autonomy. So the fact that, you have a research project and you can kind of go in and say, hey, this is what I'm going to study. And you know exactly what you want to study. And your professor and you all agree that this is the money. This is what you set aside for you to do, And then the last thing is it provides leverage for you in your career. So if you have funding that supports you as well as your research, then you can pretty much continue to do that and not take on other things like teaching, in the event that if you have to teach, you can basically buy out of that funding.
So we have a question. So we got asked, are you on a fellowship or have a grant, and how competitive are they? So both of us are on fellowships. Yeah. I have an NRSA F31. Tony has...
I have the F99 DSPAN K00, the one that was recently kind of just new. It's through the NIH. Both of these are actually through the NIH. So you can apply basically the same way that you would apply for any NIH grant. However, the F99 K00 is specifically through NINDS and Blueprint. So if you want to look that up, you definitely could, or contact us and we'll let you know how to go about doing that.
But you also had NSF, didn't you?
I did have the NSF as well.
He had NSF too, so he got two. But to the competitive question, they are competitive. I know for the NIH grants, it really depends on your section.
Yep.
So I applied for the NIDDK, which is diabetic and kidney disease section. Some will say it is not as competitive as some of the other ones, like NILB, which is like lung and blood, NILHB or something like that. It's lung and blood. So competitiveness is relative, but like a lot of the sections publish like their funding score.
Right.
So like full transparency, I got a 25 on my fellowship grant, but like funding for some section, like a good score is like 17. So the lower the number, the better. Right. So it's really relative to who you are submitting your grant to. And I think the nice thing about the F31 is you can submit to up to 2 sections.
At the same time?
Yes.
Oh, wow. That's really
good.
We
just submitted to one section because it's literally the only section that really covered the topic that I submitted. Yeah. But if I'm not mistaken, I had the option to submit to 2 different sections when I was submitting my application.
Oh, that's really cool.
It is.
The DSPAN, we don't get a percentage. We just get a raw score.
Yeah, I just got a raw score.
Oh, so you didn't get like a percentage off of, I forgot what there's some specific score.
Some do your raw score, then they tell you your percentile.
Yeah.
I just got a raw score.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, so I had no idea what a 25 meant.
Yeah,
I didn't know what
same with me.
percentile I was in.
And mine was nowhere near 25, by the way.
NIDDK doesn't publish their funding score, so I couldn't even look back to see what they typically fund. So it was kind of like, I don't know. But yeah, we both
got it.
Yeah, it was, and I don't never have to apply for another one. But it is a process, and I know he talked about, especially when you want to go into academia, but I do feel like the skills that you learn while writing, depending on how independent you were when you did it. So I wrote mine as my prelim. So mine was pretty independent when I wrote it. Mm-hmm. So I really felt like, I learned how to put together a grant, but like I literally learned how to do like experimental planning because I wrote about an experiment from scratch or a project from scratch. And like on a grant, you have to like list out every single experiment, all the details. So like it helped me like to problem solve, I guess. So like, even if you don't want to go into academia, I think it's a good thing to at least practice, even if you don't get funding. I kind of looked at it as well. I honestly went in with a negative thought, like, I don't think I'm going to get it, but it's good practice. But I got it, but it was just good practice anyway. So, yeah.
So, as we mentioned earlier, there are a lot of pre-candidate fellowships that you can apply for. NSF is the one that I applied for during my first year. Since then, the rules have kind of changed. However, they basically offer 3 years of support that you can use across 5 years. So you can pretty much figure out and kind of coordinate with your PI how you want to spread your funding. But basically, you get 3 years of full support, mainly for your stipend. As a graduate student, you can only apply once, but if you're not currently in graduate school, you actually can apply twice, one time before you go into graduate school, and then again once you're in graduate school if you don't necessarily get it.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
I thought they changed those rules in 2018.
So unless it just re-changed again, I understand it as right now, if you're not in graduate school and you don't have a master's, you can apply, and then you can apply again as graduate student. Okay. But I could be wrong. So
I mean, the website's up here. We can go look.
Yeah.
But so when I came in, they kept telling us to apply for it because you don't apply for it once.
That's correct.
And then I went to a section at Abercamp, and I thought the lady said that they changed it. Where like you can only apply once per lifetime, grad student or undergrad. So if you're interested in this fellowship, definitely look it up to see if you can apply again.
Yeah. And check, because that would have been when I applied. You could apply every year. No matter what.
Yeah, so some people were grandfathered in. So, like, if you applied as an undergraduate, you still had up until your second year, even though the rules changed because you were grandfathered in.
So maybe
it is different now. I don't know.
Feeling old. All right. So, also, you cannot apply for this fellowship if you already have a master's.
Right.
And so basically to apply, you need a personal statement, which outlines your relevant background as well as the future goals that you have for yourself. This looks really very similar to your personal statement of your application for graduate school. You also have to have a 2-page graduate research plan, which basically outlines the research that you would like to do within 3 years. And then you need 3 letters of reference, as well as your academic transcript. Okay.
So let me ask you a question for clarification. So for the graduate research plan, do you have to have one already have been accepted or have identified a faculty at an institution, or you literally are just writing like, if I could do anything, this is what I would do?
So that's really interesting. I would say that if you want to write anything, you probably could.
Okay.
However, it can't be biomedical. And I would almost suggest that you don't write anything. I would actually suggest that you write something that you actually will want to do in graduate school. And then by it being 2 pages, you don't really have a lot of time to really go into detail about a lot of things. And so what I would recommend is maybe do it on the project that you think you're going to be working on in graduate school, or a rotation project.
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe those faculty that you identified, maybe you write something that interests you that you may possibly be able to rotate in and do. Okay.
And even sense. Talk to them, and maybe they'll be willing to write a letter of recommendation for you as well. But yeah, that's something to really think about as you put this together, because a lot of people apply for NSF awards.
Yeah, a lot of people apply.
Yeah. So the deadlines are actually next week. Yeah. So if you're just starting or you're just learning about this, you can always apply next year. However, for those that are applying this year, you could pretty much see the deadlines are next week. And they basically vary based on the discipline. And then within each discipline, there are subcategories that you can actually solidify or select which ones that you actually want to do. And then your reference letters are due, I think, a week or so later.
I will say that if you do want to apply for the NSF, don't rush to try to meet this deadline, because you can apply when you get into graduate school and you can only apply once. So I would apply when you're ready to apply and not try to force just to say, oh, I applied.
Yep. And I know some people who decided in their first year that they wanted to wait till their second year, and they got it their second year.
That's what I was going to do. I was going to, because our first year, they kept, telling us, apply. And I'm like, well, I don't know how to really write this if it's not biomedical related. I'm in biomedical science program. So I talked to my PI about it, and he was like, no, we're not going to do it. We're just going to do the NIH, because NIH can be biomedical. And to me, and this is my personal preference, it just made more sense. It seemed like it would be easier because I'm already in the biomedical space to actually write about biomedical stuff instead of trying to remove the biomedical out of my project.
That's totally. I think my NSF was actually on sex differences in learning and memory.
Oh, Tony. Okay, very science-based.
So the other one is the Ford Foundation predoctoral fellowship. So with the Ford, it's very similar to the NSF. Basically, it gives you 3 years of funding for anyone that's interested in pursuing a PhD or equivalent. And basically, you can apply, I believe, as many times as a PhD or as a pre-candidate.
That's true.
And essentially, the only requirement is that, or the only limitation would be that you have to begin your first semester of graduate school September 1st, 2020. So that's next year. Meaning
if you plan on going to graduate school next fall, you are eligible because you'll be starting September 1st, September-ish 2020.
Right. And once again, all you need to apply is a personal statement, a statement of previous research and scholarly productivity. On the website, if you're planning on applying for this, they outline exactly what it is that they want the statement to look like. I would totally recommend that you read their application checklist and guidelines, because that's probably going to help guide what it is that you put in this. And if you follow that, you're more likely to get a successful award.
I think it helps that for these fellowships, you're basically the stuff that you're writing to apply to graduate school, you can use them at least as a basis for your application materials for these fellowships. So it's not like you have to do all this additional work.
Nope. And once again, 3 letters of reference, your academic transcripts. And this is actually due December 17th. So you have a little time. However, don't completely forget about it until December 1st, because then you're really going to be scrambling. However, just think about it as you go on to apply, take a break from applying to graduate school, maybe start working on your application for the Ford Foundation.
So one of the last pre-candidate fellowships we'll talk about is the National Defense Science and Engineering Graduate Fellowship. So again, offers you 3 years of supports for students pursuing a PhD or equivalent. Again, you can apply as many times as you would like as a pre-candidate. And then again, you must be in your first year by September of next year. And so there's also your degree must be within 15 of the supported disciplines that is outlined on their website. So if you are interested in this fellowship, I would say take a look at their website, see if your discipline falls within those 15 before you decide.
I think most biomedical sciences do, but you want to double check.
Define biomedical.
Biomedical sciences. So anything biology or psychology related.
Chemistry.
We had a whole discussion about biology and psychology.
Chemistry.
Chemistry would be in there.
Because like some people, there's this conversation about what's biomedical, what's a life science, what's a hard science.
That's a good
I
one.
had said that chemistry was a life science, and someone corrected me, was like, no, it's a
physical.
Yeah, and I was like, oh. And I did chemistry undergrad, but like I always consider it a life science. I also believe that chemistry is the basis for everything, including biology. So it depends on how you look at it.
Whoa.
I do.
That's totally fair.
We can talk about it later, but it is true.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
there's biochemistry.
Okay. No, chemistry is the basis. It explains the interactions that happen at the biological level. But we won't argue on camera. We won't argue about this. He thinks psychology is a biomedical science. So, But again, you need your personal statement, 500 words, a research proposal, which is 4 pages, GRE scores, 3 reference letter, and academic transcripts. So I guess the difference here on this one is that the GRE score. Yeah. So even if you don't have to take the GRE for your program that you're applying to, potentially, you're going to have to take the GRE or have taken the GRE if you want to apply for this. So that might be something that you want to consider if you want to apply for this fellowship. It doesn't hurt to take the GRE if it's within your financial means, I will say, and also your mental capacity. If you just feel like it's senior year, I don't have the mental capacity. We're not pressuring you guys into doing these fellowships. We just want to let you know that these things are out there, different funding sources for you to think about. This application is due December 6th, so right after the application deadline for most PhD programs. So these are some things you guys should consider before applying to graduate school. I often wonder, do you think if you apply for a program and you already have one of these fellowships, do you think your likelihood for getting into the program goes up? People have always told me that.
I would say almost absolutely yes.
Okay.
It's almost like walking into a lab and saying, hey, I want to do research in your lab.
And I got my own money. Yeah.
Would you set me up a desk? And I think people will kind of say, here's a bench. Do what you want to do.
But I guess all this really depends on, though, when you get the fellowship, because if the deadline's aren't until December, you still don't know if you have a fellowship.
Well, you will know, though, before September 1st.
Before you go into the program.
And I think you'll know about NSF probably in April.
Yeah, because since that's sooner.
Mm-hmm.
That's fair. But just things for you guys to think about if you want to start applying for money before you start graduate school. These are some options for you. This is not, these are not the only fellowships. These are just the most common that people in this space apply for, but you can definitely look online to see what else is out there. There may be private fellowships that you can also apply for.
Yep.
So we'll talk about some of the pre-doctoral fellowships and grants once you actually get into graduate school. So 2 of the most common we'll talk about come from the National Institutes of Health, or the NIH. And so Tony's going to talk a little bit about the T32.
Yeah, so the T32 is basically an institutional grant. So basically what's happened is someone at the institution, a faculty member, has kind of put together a training plan for a group of students in a specific field or discipline. And so what this does is it basically allows for the support and training of those graduate students within their program. And so these are typically program specific, although some graduate programs have their own, as well as some research groups actually have their own. And these are basically as specific as maybe sensory science or sensory neuroscience or addiction. And basically there'll be things or requirements or sorry, the word escaped me, but basically things that you have to do in order to basically fulfill the requirements and the needs of that grant. The requirements do change based on kind of what institution, what grant, and what T32 you're applying for. And they typically fund you for at least a year, maybe 2 to 3 years.
It funds you as a student or as a program?
Ooh, that's great. So it'll probably provide support for you as a student. However, I do know that some require that you have some component of your research be a part of that discipline.
Okay.
Yep.
And also the F31, which is the grant that I currently have, or the fellowship. So it is for trainings that are specific to the individual and their research and training plan. So for my application, I had to do a 6-page proposal. And most of the I will say most, if not all the time, you would definitely want to have some preliminary data for these. And these are not things that are outlined. It doesn't say you have to have preliminary data. So when I did I myself did not have any preliminary data as a student. My lab had some preliminary data.
Right.
You also, I don't think you technically have to have your own preliminary data that came out of your lab. It could have been something that was published by a group, and this is the basis for your work. But you kind of have to frame their work in a minimal light and highlight the work that you will be doing after, if that makes sense. So the proposal is mainly your work. So you also have to talk about your training plan in addition to your research plan that is specific to your development as a student as well as your dissertation. So I had to talk about in year 1, 2, 3, and 4 of my funding, because I got 4 years of funding. What do I plan on doing as a student in addition to my research plan to train? So like I talked about the different cores that are here, like so different classes I could take. I also talked about science communication. So it doesn't have to strictly be what are you going to be doing technically in the lab, but like what is your training plan going forward to become a better, well-rounded scientist and researcher? And this typically funds you, I will say 4. It depends on when you apply. So I applied my second year. My second year, that first semester of my second year, and I got 4 years of funding. So technically I have funding up until my 6th year of my program. I do want to say this is most of the times better to apply for this award earlier. If you're in your 4th year and you apply for this fellowship, the likelihood goes down because it funds you for 4 years. You can always give the money back, but as a reviewer looking at your application, you only have a year left. So they're likely not, unless you're just an exceptional applicant, the likelihood kind of goes down because this grant is to fund someone for the majority of their time as a PhD student. So again, mine is 4 years. I only plan on using 3. I plan on being out in 5, y'all. But if I have to have 6 year, I have funding. Otherwise, we'll just send the extra year back. So these are things that you all don't have to consider now, but once you get into your programs next semester, you definitely want to think about the different funding sources that are available to you. And T32s and F31s are the most common funding sources in this space.
So we have a question. Are there a limit to the number of T32s that you can apply for or that a student can receive?
So I can only speak for our institution and how they work. The answer is no. You can apply for as many as you want to. I just don't think you can accept. So that goes for all of the grants that we talked about. So I was actually going to apply for a T32. The grad student in my lab, she applied for a T32, and then she also applied for F31. So she got the T32. Her F31 came later. So she just switched fellowships and just didn't use the money. So you don't have to stay on one fellowship, but you are not limited on what you can apply for.
Right.
So while I applied for the F31, I also applied for the Howard Hughes Medical Institute Fellowship simultaneously. And so for the F31, they asked us, have you applied for an additional funding? And what is the verdict? So we have to put that we applied for this. We're still waiting to hear back. So you can apply for multiple sources of funding. It's kind of like whatever you get first. If I would have got both, I would have just had to choose. A lot of the grants and fellowships that come from at least government funding, you can't stack them. I don't know why, but they won't let you stack them.
So I think, you basically said it. You can't take on, in a lot of cases, typically you're going to have to pick and choose which grant you're going to kind of accept. However, if you get them and you are awarded them, you can put on your CV that you were successfully awarded them.
Yes.
So that's something to think about. But that doesn't mean spend all your time applying for grants.
I mean, if that's what you want to do as a person. I mean, grant writing is a career that you can also do. So if you want to write grants, you're a graduate student. Tony likes writing, clearly, but
I don't know about that one, but
I'm done. This is it. But if you like writing grants, write grants. You can put them on your CV. You don't have to accept the money. So if you really just want to build your CV and say, I was successfully awarded this, this, and this, you were still offered the invitation for the fellowship. So I would have had to put, I had the Howard Hughes and the NIH, but this is a fellowship I accepted.
Right. So there are a lot of different alternative funding mechanisms. So these aren't the only way that you can get funding. So one of the more traditional ones is basically graduate research assistantship. And so with that, basically you're working with your PI or your thesis advisor on their grants, basically to help kind of support the research that your lab is doing, as well as typically there's some portion of that you can then use as your dissertation or your thesis work. And so that's definitely a way that a lot of people fund their graduate education.
And this comes from the PI.
Yes, this comes from the PI. So this isn't from you, and your PI basically is funding all of your graduate school expenses, essentially. There are also teaching appointments, as Sierra mentioned earlier. So as a requirement for our program, you have to teach at least a semester. However,
Same.
some programs may have longer or more extensive
Mhm.
teaching requirements. The other way that you can also just fund your stipend is basically by taking on teaching appointments. So these may range anywhere from teaching a small like lab to basically a full lecture class, depending on the institution. I do know some people actually go to other institutions and also teach. So that's something to think
Mm.
about, but also consider the time that you have and the amount of research and things that that you have going on as well.
I will say, if you are a master's student, 8 times or 9 times out of 10, you're going to have a teaching appointment to pay for your stipend. Also, even if teaching is not a requirement to cover your stipend, you can potentially use it to supplement your stipend, like additional funds.
Yeah.
So I did my 1-year requirement. If I ever wanted to be a GSI again, it would just be extra money. At that point, it would become a job.
Yep.
And we'll talk about that a little bit. And so, lastly, we want to talk about institutional fellowships, which are merit-based. So again, I came in on Rackham Merit Fellowship. I also had this other fellowship. It was a smaller fellowship. It was like a one-time $5,000 fellowship, but it was also a merit-based fellowship.
Nice.
And that fellowship kind of was like, this is just extra $5,000. We don't really care what you do with it, but you got to report it as income. So it was nice because it helped with like additional expenses that I had to get here. I couldn't use the funds until I actually got here, but like once I got here, there was some other like, when you move to a new place and then you got to do some stuff. So there are definitely institutional fellowships that are alternative funding sources. So we do not have working a part-time job on here like undergrad. So a lot of PhD programs prohibit you from working. Sometimes it's in your contract, sometimes it's not. But you're expected to be a full-time graduate student when you're in these kind of programs.
Yeah.
You may have to, if you need to work, because sometimes, honestly, I kind of want a job sometimes. I'm like, if I just, work Saturday and Sunday, because that's what I did when I was in my post-bac. Monday through Friday, I was in school. Saturday and Sunday, I had a job at the pharmacy. I can't do that here because my obligations are different. My responsibilities are different. But if you need to work, that's definitely something that you want to discuss before you at least accept your package. Like if you know that there are a lot of people, especially I will say underrepresented students, that play a role in providing for their family. And if you're going to continue to be some kind of provider and you want to work or need to work, I think that's something that you should discuss with at least the coordinator of the program that you're applying for to see if that's an option for you.
Or different ways that you can do it. Maybe there's some other type of fellowship, whether it be a teaching appointment or some type of position, or I'm trying to think of the word.
There's tutoring. You can. So there are some jobs that are at the institution level that you actually can do. So GSI is technically a job. You can also tutor.
But the admins would typically know how to go about finding these types of things so that you don't have to go and take something that's completely separate from the institution and kind of may present, in some cases, more of a burden. Yeah,
because usually if you're working at the institution, it's a little bit more flexible because they already know that you're a student and what your requirements are.
Yep.
So working is not a no-no, but like if you need it, if it's something that's important to you, definitely inquire about it.
Yep.
So just to go over, the application timeline, we talked about money. So we're in October now. So there's still time between now and December for the application deadline. In relation to our workshop, so this is, again, the last and final one for the semester. I know, bittersweet. But all that means is you can submit your application materials to us for us to review. So from yesterday until November 17th, I do have that in asterisk. So November 17th is 2 weeks before the December 1st deadline. So when you send your materials to us, I ask that you do within a 2-week window from your due date. So if your application is due December 1st, November 17th should be the very last day that you send us your materials, just so we're able to give you adequate feedback, but then also make sure that other people are still reviewing your materials and not just us.
Mhm.
But however, if your application, there are some schools that are like March. Well, South Boston Morehouse School of Medicine and North Carolina Central, those are in March.
Oh, nice.
So your application is not due until March. If you want to send your materials in January or February, let's say February, but at least 2 weeks prior to the deadline, that gives us time to give you adequate feedback.
Right. And then just kind of to tell you what's coming ahead, next semester, essentially January, all of those applications will be in. You'll be notified about your interviews, and we'll basically come back with the next set of webinars where we'll talk about kind of how to go about grad school interviews, choosing the best fit. So what program works best for you, and how Sierra and I went about making that decision. And then the transition, going from an HBCU undergraduate institution to going into graduate school, and what was it like to be a PhD graduate student?
Right.
Things and tips and things that we should have.
Yes, the pros and the cons, because there are cons to everything. But that last session, we're going to record live, and you will have the live link, but we will take it down. So our website will be launching soon. I know we talked about this earlier. Yeah. Videos 1 through 5 will be on the website for you to view all the time. Video 6, we want to keep this private with you all. We want you to be able to ask the hard questions that you don't feel comfortable. Maybe everybody knowing that you asked. So we will keep it up maybe for 2 weeks after we go live, just so you can revisit it. But we will not be posting on the website because that is kind of, your space. For number 4, it will be in January, and we are going to actually let you all choose what date you want to start that on, because we know, like, we don't get time off like y'all get time off. We know y'all usually come back mid-January.
Yeah, after MLK, right before MLK,
and that's usually when interviews actually start. So we want to give you guys the opportunity to choose the date, even if that's over winter break. We'll be here, so we can definitely accommodate you all. But that'll come, in a later email. So definitely make sure you contact us if you have any questions. Our email is the same. We're still on Twitter. If you want to do a Twitter chat, mention us, use the hashtag HBCU-DAP. If you just want to see things that people have talked about, you can search the hashtag HBCU-DAP and look at the tweets where people have used that hashtag. Again, our website is launching very soon. So if you haven't already, please subscribe so that you can be the first to be notified once we actually go live, and we'll have all the resources, mentorship, and support all in one place for you.